Okay, thank you everyone for joining Schoolhouse Connection for our webinar on student homelessness and what Indiana communities can do about it. My name is Ashanti Jones. I'm joined here by my colleague Rod Mons. We'll do a little bit more of a formal introduction as we hop in. But I just want to thank you all for joining us today. As you all come in, you can put your name, your organization, and where you're coming from in the chat, just so we can get to know one another a little bit. That'd be awesome. I know you're not able to come on camera, but you can communicate with us through the chat. You can write any questions, any comments, and feedback in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those as we move forward in our conversation. And so we'll stop multiple times to answer any questions in real time. So feel free to put anything that you want to share with the group in the chat feature so that we can engage with you all accordingly. So as I stated previously, my name is Ashanti Jones. I serve as the Senior Policy and Advocacy Manager at Schoolhouse Connection. Schoolhouse Connection is an organization, it's a national nonprofit that works to overcome homelessness through education. We utilize strategic advocacy and practical assistance with multiple states by engaging with schools, early childhood programs, higher education institutions, service providers, and we really try to engage with impacted young people as much as possible. Before I joined Schoolhouse Connection, the person who was doing most of this work was Rod Mons, and I'll turn it over to him now to give himself a chance to introduce himself and to talk a little bit more about what we do here.
Thank you, Ashanti. As she mentioned, I am the Director of State Policy here at Schoolhouse Connection, which gives me an opportunity to work with our partners across the state on policy reforms aimed at addressing youth homelessness, and have had an opportunity to work with our State Policy Fellows program, which, while it is a collaboration with folks in different states around the country, focuses on our federal work, which we'll talk more about today. And I am based in Michigan. So our Policy Fellows program is an initiative which gives Schoolhouse an opportunity to connect and mobilize a network of our allies who are stakeholders with some connection to youth homelessness across the country. We prioritize legislative districts that have key members of Congress that we work with to try to get legislation aimed at supporting youth homelessness policy reform introduced and passed. And we have also, along the way, engaged some of our fellows in some state level work as a result of some of the interactions they've had with elected officials. Our advocates include service providers from education and community organizations, as well as young people who've been impacted by homelessness. In Indiana, we've had an opportunity to engage with a handful of fellows who include service providers, a few of whom work with the Youth Service Bureau in St. Joseph County. And we had a young leader who was very active as well. Earlier this year, we had an opportunity to train those fellows and assist them in planning and executing a legislative visit with the late Representative Jackie Worlowski's office. Her staff was tremendous, and we really did enjoy an opportunity to interact with them. We have not yet had an opportunity to engage with Representative Worlowski's replacement, Representative Kim, but we hope to be able to do so in the next session.
And so unfortunately, our Indiana Policy Fellows were not able to join us today, but we are here on their behalf to share this information with you all. And we hope that there definitely is a wealth of knowledge being presented here today. And we hope that you're able to learn something and continue to fight alongside us as we continue to advocate for young people who are experiencing homelessness. And by now, I'm hoping that everyone is feeling welcome in this space. I know a few people trickled in. If you don't mind sharing your name and where you're from in the chat box, that would be incredible as we try to, get to know one another in this virtual space. We'll now move into our introduction to student homelessness and why we're all here today. we'll talk a little bit about what we're advocating for and things that you all can do to move this work forward. So homelessness in and of itself impacts about 1.1 million young people. A few years ago, before the pandemic, that number was up at about 1.4 million. And the reason why it's at 1.1 million is not because we have solved homelessness for those 300,000 people, but rather that the pandemic made it increasingly difficult to identify and communicate with students once we moved to virtual learning. And homelessness, as you may know, impacts other areas such as the ability to participate in virtual learning and have a stable and fixed place to be educated. And so today we are able to identify around 1.1 million students who are experiencing homelessness between pre-K and 12. And so these numbers are from 2020 to 2021. So obviously the numbers can have changed in this new year, but this is the latest number that we have from the National Center for Homeless Education. Okay, and so as was already stated, many schools have reported a ton of challenges with identifying and communicating with students who are experiencing homelessness. And so a lot of the work that Schoolhouse Connection does, but also that we're hoping that all of you would be able to leave here to do today, is to advocate for the federal provisions that would allow us to be able to overcome those barriers and challenges. And so homelessness looks like more than just people openly living on the street, right? Homelessness has many faces, okay? And whether that's staying in a motel, if it's paid by wages or by a charitable organization, or staying with people following an eviction. It could also look like people who are staying in domestic violence or any other types of shelters. And it also could look like couch surfing, right? Rotating between many homes, not necessarily having a room or anything like that. And it also can look like living in doubled up or tripled up situations where more than one family is, sharing a space that's only meant for one family. And so these are all different types of homelessness. And unfortunately, a lot of these forms are hidden. Young people don't necessarily recognize that they're homeless when they're in one of these situations, which also makes it very difficult for the people who should be situated to help them, like liaisons and educators and school professionals, to be able to identify that they are homeless and support them in the work in completing their education. And so when it comes to the number of young people who are experiencing homelessness in Indiana, that number is around 15,364 students. And so of those students, around 973 of them are unaccompanied. And so what that means is that these are young people who are minors, but do not have any adult figure who's in charge of their care or their education. So they're unaccompanied homeless youth, young people who need access to education and other resources that are available to them, but they don't necessarily have that parent advocate. Of these 15,000 students who are homeless, 200 of them are unsheltered, which means that there is no domestic violence shelter or homeless shelter or doubled up or tripled up situation for them. They're literally living on the street or in shelter or in spaces in the community that are not situated for living. Okay, around 1,500 of those students live in shelters, and 1,675 of them are in hotels or motels, which can obviously cause an economic burden or strain on the family. And the majority of students, around 11,000, are doubled up or tripled up in situations. And so this large number here is referring to people who are sharing, multiple families in a single family dwelling or something similar to that. These are the majority of young people who don't recognize that they're experiencing homelessness, right? Because they technically do have a roof over their heads, even though it's not necessarily theirs or situated to house that many people. And that makes it increasingly difficult to recognize that young people are experiencing homelessness. Before I move on, I just want to reiterate the fact that the chat box and the Q&A box are both open for questions, comments, and feedback. So if you have anything that you want us to, to answer for you or lift up or just take into consideration as we move throughout this presentation, please utilize those features so that we can get you get those answered and actually have some sort of conversation here today. Thank you. All right, and so the impact on homelessness on education. And so 42% of students who experience homelessness say that they dropped out of school at least once. Around 60% of those students say that it was hard to stay in school while they were homeless for obvious reasons, right? And so homelessness and education are tied, right? Not only is homelessness associated with the 87% likelihood of young people dropping out or being disproportionately impacted by school disciplinary practices or being chronically absent, there are also significant achievement gaps between young people who are homeless and those who are just low income students, okay? So without addressing homelessness and its impact on education, that gap between young people who are homeless and those who are low income will persist and may worsen over time. And so education is the key to overcoming homelessness as a young adult. And so without having a high school diploma or a GED, young people are at risk for young adult homelessness 346% more than if they had a high school diploma. So that's more than double, more than triple, right? So when you think about having a high school diploma, that's kind of like your access to the job market, right? More than 2/3 of jobs require some form of post-secondary education. Now, without having a high school diploma or a GED to be able to access, higher education, you won't necessarily be able to overcome youth homelessness. Okay, and so the McKinney-Vento Act is one of the most important strategies to overcome homelessness. And it has been even more important during the pandemic when even people who were not experiencing homelessness or any kind of low income situation were struggling. A lot of us were, laid off or having to depend on certain like community funds or unemployment benefits in order just to get by. And so you can only imagine that not being able to access education and the types of things that young people need, like, food and regular shelter, will obviously have a significant impact on young people who are experiencing homelessness. And so the McKinney-Vento Act removes barriers for students experiencing homelessness by keeping students in their school of origin. So if a young person was enrolled in a certain district and they were experiencing homelessness and maybe needed to, go to, live with someone else or couch surf somewhere or a shelter that was slightly out of district, students will still be able to remain in their school. They would not necessarily have to switch schools. They would also be provided with transportation. So transportation and be able to actually get to and from school would not be a barrier for those students. It also provides immediate enrollment if that student does need to, change school districts. And it also provides several mechanisms to assist students through graduation and beyond that. And so Schoolhouse Connection actually does a lot of work with higher education as well, to ensure that the same provisions that are given to students through McKinney-Vento liaisons is translated to higher education if they choose to go that route. And so higher education liaisons are something that we advocate for as well. And so homelessness, as we talked about on a few slides back about the various different phases of homelessness, those were translated into specific definitions that would allow us to recognize who'd be eligible for McKinney-Vento services. So all of those students who are lacking in that fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, maybe they have to share housing, right, with others due to loss of their housing or any kind of economic hardship, right? Around 77% of students who are identified for McKinney-Vento in 2020 and 2021 were sharing housing with folks. So that's that doubled up, tripled up situation. Around 8% of those students were living in motels or hotels because they didn't have any other alternative accommodations. And then you have students who are living in emergency shelters or transitional shelters. Around 11% of students who were McKinney-Vento eligible were living in those types of shelters. And then you have those young people who are living who are living pretty much on the streets, right? So not having, not having a private residence, but living in any kind of public place, like a car, a park, abandoned building, or any kind of substandard housing. Those are also definitions that are covered under McKinney-Vento. And so I'm going to stop here to see if there are any questions or if anyone has any comments at this juncture. And I do want to encourage you all to ask that in this space, even though, we will be able to answer any questions, after this, but we are here now. And so we'll be happy to answer anything live. I'm not seeing any at this exact moment, but it's still open. And we hope that you do utilize it. Okay. And so, as you know, we've just had elections, right? And so there are some issues that we have for the tail end of the current Congress. Okay, and so what we are asking for, or really looking at this current Congress, is a final fiscal year 2023 budget, right? We definitely want homeless children and youth funding, additional funding for that, and also additional funding for the Runaway Homeless Youth Act. We're also asking for Housing for Homeless Student Act to not only receive passage, but funding. And so what this does is pushing for reform of the low-income housing tax credit. And so these are some of the issues that we're currently dealing with the current Congress, and we're hoping that we'll be able to kind of square up before we actually move on into the 118th Congress. So I'm going to turn it over to Rod now, just to talk a little bit about these budgetary concerns and kind of where we are.
Thank you, Ashante. So the current status of the budget is that the House has passed some of its funding bills. The Senate Appropriations Committee has released draft bills, but there has been no final legislation passed yet. There's a continuing resolution in place that will basically keep the federal funding at its current level for a couple more weeks, but there's pressure now for Congress to get something done. So we want to try to take advantage of these final days of the session to push for as much funding for youth homelessness issues as we possibly can.
Yep. And so for 2023, we're looking at these funding levels, right? And so the president's level that, he's encouraging, it may be different from the current level that we already have. And then obviously there's a little bit of dissonance between what the House proposes and what the Senate proposes, right? And so you'll see that, like, for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, the president is, asking for $110 million, which is a little bit below what we currently are. We're currently at our $114 million. So obviously we are not advocating for a decrease in funding at all. But thankfully, the House and Senate have both proposed increases. And so obviously we want to target the highest available amount. And so right now the Senate has proposed a 32% increase of $150 million for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program. And so our advocacy is really geared towards making sure that we're getting the highest funding levels available. We see something very similar with the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program, where we are currently at $140.3 million. The president has, asked for an increase in that for about $150 million. And then the House has again gone above that and said $155 million, while the Senate is proposing $151 million. So obviously there's a bit of dissonance here, but the advocacy is always towards the highest number. And so that would be $150 million for Education for Homeless Children and Youth program, and $155 million for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program.
So as we wind toward the end of the session, we're going to be working to support the reintroduction of the Housing and Homeless Student Act. This is significant because it includes the low-income housing tax credit. It's a program that provides a reduction in a property owner's tax liability for building or rehabbing low-income rental housing. The program doesn't allow tenants enrolled to be full-time students unless they're former foster youth or TANF recipients. This is significant because unaccompanied homeless and formerly homeless youth aren't exempt. So they have to choose between whether they want housing or whether they want to pursue a full-time education. And as Ashanti laid out earlier, it's critical that youth access education to prevent homelessness and continuing homelessness into adulthood. So This act is critical, and the good thing is that it's bipartisan. It would allow students who are homeless to be housed and continue education if they've experienced homelessness within the past 7 years. You can go to the next slide. So I think you skipped one, actually. There we go. So the legislation was just reintroduced this month, and we are working over lame duck these next few weeks to see if we can get it across the finish line. The great thing is, as you can see here by the list of co-sponsors, it's that it's bipartisan in both the House and in the Senate, and there's no fiscal impact. So it does a lot of good and doesn't cost anything. So we're going to be engaging as many advocates as we can in the work that we need to do before the end of this session. And we're beginning to look ahead to the next Congress. As you can see here, since the November 8th election, many of the races have finally been certified. On the House side, Republicans hold a slim majority. 220 to 213. I think that may have increased to 221 today. And the Senate already holds a majority of 50 to 49 with one race still left to go. So Democrats will control the House. Democrats will control the White House and the Senate, and Republicans will control the House. The narrow majorities mean that bipartisan efforts are going to be really important. So as we begin to look at our advocacy and who we involve, having people from districts that are both Republican and Democratic will be important to the success of our work going forward. And as the new Congress members come to the Hill, we plan to use January as a time to begin educating folks on the importance of advocating for policies that support children and youth experiencing homelessness in their communities and across their states. We are currently working on a new online dashboard that will provide a snapshot of student homelessness by state, and you'll be able to drill down to school district. And this also includes an opportunity to talk to Congress members about what's going on in their particular districts, which they're going to be most interested in, obviously. And it's one of the many tools that we try to provide, not only our policy fellows, but other stakeholders that we recruit into advocacy so they can have thoughtful and informed conversations with their elected officials.
Thank you, Rod. And so Rod has given us some great background on where we were and where we are in terms of budget and the makeup of the new Congress. And so now that we know when the best time to educate is, to educate our new legislators, the thing that we want to focus on next is talking about our top federal legislative priorities for homeless children, youth, and their families. Okay, and so the three areas that we'll focus on next, and we know that we're talking about a lot of different things and covering a lot of ground here, so feel free to please use the chat and Q&A functions if you need any clarity on anything that we've dove into or about to dive into. So the three things that we're going to focus on next is talking about federal flexible funding, right, to support homeless children and youth, to remove barriers for higher education for homeless and foster youth, and to also reform homelessness assistance to better meet the needs of children, youth, and families. And so these are our top three priorities for the year, and I'm going to go through each of them. And so obviously, if any questions come up, feel free to use the chat and Q&A feature so we can get those answered. And so first, when it comes to flexible funding for students who are experiencing homelessness, the big ask has been to increase the annual appropriation to $800 million, okay, for flexible funding. And so we're asking for that number moving forward, primarily because the American Rescue Plan gave this amount of money, right? And so the goal is to sustain the program and the impacts that we've been able to have. And so Rod will drop in the chat some of the ARP highlights that different states have been doing with this type of funding. But one thing that we do know about the ARP funds and what they've been doing for states is that, one, it's increased the appropriations 8 times. By 8 times. So we get around $100 million annually for this program, and to continue to support young people, to continue to identify and enroll, right, and support young people to and through graduation. But obviously, you know, having $800 million annually would do tons to be able to support these young people. Right now, only about a quarter of educational institutions in the country are able to actually identify young people. We know that with 1.1 million students, and some of them who have dropped off because we've lost contact with them, there are so many students who could utilize the support from McKinney-Vento liaisons and other supports as they try to get to and through school. And so having $800 million, right, would be more funding than the previous 10 years of funding that we've had combined, right? And so we have to be able to sustain the work that we've been able to do during the pandemic, after the pandemic, right? Because young people are still homeless, their families are still struggling, and they need to have access to education in order to not experience homelessness as young adults. So Rod.
You can help by continuing the work to lift up the creative ways in which people have used this funding to better support the students experiencing homelessness in their community. We have included here a few of those ways, including keeping both hard and soft data on the impact of ARP funds on increasing student outcomes, or establishing new relationships and systems that better benefit students, and collecting those stories of families and youth who are assisted as a result of the creative use of ARP funds. We're also engaging people who are interested in working through local media to gain coverage of those creative uses of ARP funds or ARP-related activities, or the additional capacity they've been able to create as a result of having this additional funding. And it's significant to highlight all of this work because elected officials are also paying attention to media. So the more that we can do to shine light on the great work being done on the ground, the better chances we have of connecting with the people who are going to help us change the laws that we need to get changed. So let us know if you are interested in being connected to your Congress members. We're going to continue to make that ask. And I'll share more about that in a few slides. And I will also drop a link into the chat where you can go if you are interested in learning more.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Ron. And so the second priority was surrounding removing barriers to higher education for homeless and foster youth. And so, as I mentioned before, the McKinney-Vento liaisons are critical to not only identifying students who are experiencing homelessness, but also navigating the ARP funding to make sure that young people and their families have what they need to ensure that their student is successful. But once they graduate from high school, that is not like the end all be all to their lives. Sometimes higher education is what young people aspire to, and it is critical to know in order to engage in the workforce the majority of the time. And so having higher education liaisons is critical to be able to make sure that there's continuity of services and care for young people who are experiencing homelessness. And so we're hoping to see a reintroduction of the bipartisan bill, the Higher Education Access and Success for Homeless and Foster Youth Act. And so we refer to that because it's super long as HCY, right? And so the HCY Act was introduced before, but it didn't really get anywhere. And so again, another reason why we brought you all here today is just to talk about some of the provisions that HCY will provide to young people. And hopefully with this new Congress that's coming in, there are some new faces and people who are not familiar with these issues, who we can target, inform them, and lobby to get them to pass this type of legislation. So we're hoping to see a reintroduction of this legislation that would support, you know, the requirement to designate higher education liaisons for foster and homeless youth, right? It will also require a plan for housing for both during the semester and during school breaks for students who are experiencing homelessness, and it will also provide priority for on-campus housing for those students, right? Young people will also be provided with in-state tuition, right? So there isn't necessarily an increase in how much money it would actually cost them to go there if they're coming from out of state. And so there's a ton of other provisions, right, that are within HCY. And so the link is here, and you guys will get a copy of this presentation where you can actually interact with it and click on all the links and everything. And so you're able to read the full list if you're interested of all the things that HCY is requiring once you get the presentation. And so lastly, the thing that we are advocating for, our third priority, is removing barriers to accessing homeless assistance and housing. And so again, a reintroduction of bipartisan legislation that will reform HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, homeless assistance, and increase access for children, youth, and families. And so the three things that this legislation would do would align the federal definitions of homelessness by amending HUD's current definition so that children and youth who have been identified by one of 8 federal programs, right, which include McKinney-Vento liaisons, right, would be eligible for HUD homeless assistance. So basically what that's saying is that the definition would change in a way that would increase our knowledge of what is considered homelessness, but also expands on how many different programs would be eligible to identify somebody as being homeless. So any one of 8 federal programs would be able to refer people for HUD homeless assistance. It will also require HUD to honor any local community priorities and needs rather than just their own. And it also would help to improve data collection on homelessness. If we were able to get an accurate picture of how many students are experiencing homelessness, we'd be able to better advocate for young people experiencing homelessness, to be able to provide the correct level of homeless assistance and housing programs for them. And so we're hoping to be able to get this bill reintroduced as well. So I'm going to turn over to Rod now just to talk about our 3 big asks.
Thank you, Ashante. So our asks today are, 1, to urge your U.S. reps and senators to fund EHCY and RHYA at the highest of the 2 proposed levels that Ashante referenced earlier, $150 million for EHCY and $155 million for RHYA. We actually include a link here that you can use to contact your congressional members. The second ask is for your U.S. reps to co-sponsor the Bipartisan Housing for Homeless Students Act. That's the legislation I mentioned before that includes the low-income housing tax credit. So homeless students aren't forced to choose either housing or education. They can actually have both. And we put together an action alert that you can use for that outreach. And we want to continue the $800 million in funding so that local districts have the flexibility to come up with creative solutions for addressing the issues that students experiencing homelessness are facing in their communities. So we need your assistance in reaching out to reps to make that happen.
Thank you, Rod. So are there any questions? So we'll give you a few minutes just to gather any questions that you may have or any comments. We're also looking for feedback. If there's anything in this presentation that you felt like we didn't cover or any information you want to share, you can feel free to put any of those comments or feedback in the chat or the Q&A as well. We'll be sure to address them. And I also want to use this moment just to say thank you all for joining us today. We really do appreciate your time and your interest in understanding how you can utilize your personal power and capacity to advocate for our young people who are experiencing homelessness. And so we want to encourage all of you to stay up to date with not only us, but the issues that we've spoken about today. And so you can utilize the link that Rod has put into the chat already, or just go to congress.gov to see if your member has signed on as a co-sponsor of any of the bills that we mentioned today. If they didn't, you can also, check out their social media and utilize that as a way to just mention them or tag them in something just to let them know, like, hey, we want this to be a priority of yours as we move into the next Congress. You can also stay up to date with us and see any progress on any of these bills by signing up for our newsletter. And so you'll be able to actually click on that link once you get this presentation and sign up for our e-newsletter. And you'll also be able to check out our federal policy page just to get a sense of if there are any updates that you should be privy to. Rob will also share our advocacy sign up link in the chat. And so you can use these last few moments to actually click that link and sign up for our advocacy alert so that you can stay connected to us and also learn what we're doing. And we'll also reach out to you with different opportunities for advocacy as well. And you can always feel free to email any questions, comments, or concerns that came up for you after this presentation by emailing either Rod or myself. And that is just Ashanti@schoolhouseconnection.org or Rod@schoolhouseconnection.org. You can also, if you don't want to type in or click the link, you can also utilize your phone just to look at the QR code that will also pull up our advocacy sign up. And so we also provide support to various states and we help to set up virtual meetings. We help you prep for legislative meetings. We also support you with providing 1 or 2 pagers on any of the issues that you're interested in. We also help provide writing, talking points, or testimony or anything that you feel will kind of push your legislation over the line. We also support with drafting some of that legislation. So if there's anything that we didn't necessarily cover today, but there are issues that you feel are connected to young people experiencing homelessness and you'd love to get something on your legislature about it, we're more than interested in supporting you in writing that legislation. So feel free to reach out to us, stay connected to us. We are a national organization, but you know your state best. And so we're really relying on you not only to engage your legislators and your representatives on these issues, but to also look at where there are any gaps that can be filled for young people who are experiencing homelessness. And so with that, I just want to say thank you again for your time. Hi, Rory. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate all of your time. And I hope that you all have a wonderful evening and we look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thanks for joining us.